the lockdown did more harm than good. Well, we're going to have to start accepting soon that we live in a world where not everything's within our control.
Right, let's do a bit of recap. March 2020, the UK government introduced a 3-week lockdown to protect the NHS and its capacity. Well, the NHS wasn't overwhelmed even before the lockdown, yet the government continued with those measures for months and months. In March, again, the government also introduced these emergency powers so that the executive could exercise them without scrutiny. But luckily, pro-freedom MPs such as Steve Baker, David Davis and a number of others ensured that we have a 6-month clause. So after 6 months, we review these emergency powers that the government are exercising. Well, the time has come to do that. Next week in Parliament, the government has to essentially go through the whole process, and we have a number of Tory MPs and a number of others who have gotten together, again with Steve Baker, Sir Graham Brady, David Davis and others as well, to ensure that there is a debate and a vote, because the executive cannot just exercise these powers without scrutiny and without getting the consent of the people from across this country and their representative, who are the members of Parliament. Now on this show, we actually have a special guest. We have Steve Baker MP, who is going to be explaining exactly what's happening and why he's against these draconian measures and all potential full second lockdown. Just a quick heads up, this is a very good interview. He's going to explain everything, but unfortunately, after we recorded it, I realised that the sound quality from Steve's side isn't great. So you might get slightly annoyed, but just be patient, just go through with it. It's a good interview. He's going to explain everything. It's just worth it. Watch this and then we'll come back. For those of you who don't know, could you explain what's exactly happening?
What exactly is happening, I'll give it a go. But can I start with, in general, what is happening is we're trying to make sure that Parliament gets a vote before our liberties are taken away in future. But what's happening here is that David Davis, supported by others like me, managed to get a 6-month review of the Virus Act into law. That review is next Wednesday. So there's a motion which has to be passed for the powers to stay in law. Here's a problem though, there are now 100 acts of Parliament being used to pass secondary legislation which affects our lives. So the Public Health Act 1984, aptly named, is the one that was used for the main lockdown. That isn't on the table next Wednesday. But what we're trying to do is use this parliamentary moment to create a way of saying to the government and to the public, actually MPs no longer are willing to surrender control over the law. The government has been ruling by fiat for far too long. It was perhaps justifiable at the beginning when people were terribly afraid of just how bad the disease might be. Now that we know much more, we know that it is a very dangerous disease for people with comorbidities, other conditions, but for most of us it isn't. And so in these circumstances, there is time for the government to use the normal procedure of putting statutory instruments before Parliament for a yes-no vote before they take away our freedoms. So we're using this moment to say you've really got to change, and I hope that we'll be able to win that argument, reach a consensus and avoid a rebellion next week.
You and obviously David Davis and a few others pushed through this 6 months kind of clause essentially, and also now this amendment is happening. So it's to be fair, it's nothing to do with ideology. It's about common sense and what's right at the time. And you're still obviously there. You're still fighting for a good fight.
Yeah, look, stepping back, I'm an engineer, and if you were flying in an aeroplane that I'd fixed, you'd expect me to have a really good theoretical grasp of how aircraft fly, and then to apply those ideas practically to get a safe aeroplane up in the air. And just like that in politics, you need good solid ideas and to be pragmatic. And part of that pragmatism is fighting battles you can win. So this battle we're having next Wednesday to get the government to revert to asking Parliament's permission before taking away our freedom, that is a radically moderate point of view and a battle we should win.
Yes. What's your view on that? Obviously, you mentioned the beginning in terms of when it started and what people thought, because we didn't know much about it. The original idea, in terms of the messaging, was the government said, let's have a 3-week lockdown and we'll review it. Initially to protect the NHS and the capacity. But since then, I think when it comes to the executive, the messaging got a bit mixed up. What do you think?
Well, the government seems to have very clearly changed policy from protecting the NHS and flattening the curve through to suppressing the virus and trying to have zero And that I don't think is a practical proposition. But this is why I've written to Boris and suggested some reforms to the way that advice is provided. Scientists are only human too, and we've been asking the impossible from them. So if you're a scientist and you recommend lockdown, however many people die, you can always say more would have died if we hadn't had lockdown.
Yep.
But if you don't recommend lockdown, you recommend something more moderate, and people die, you can get the blame. That is a bad outcome. That is to simplify a very thick economics book by a friend of mine called Professor Roger Coppell. I boiled it down to a one-page brief for Boris. I've published it on my Twitter feed. And I think we need to basically solve two ends of this problem. At the input end, we need to change the structure of scientific advice, more competitive advice and more devil's advocates and so forth, and really challenge the scientists, because there is uncertainty and they're not always absolutely right. And there's, as everyone watching this will know, there's room for challenge. And at the other end, you need in Parliament to get parliamentarians' permission before taking away people's liberty. So I want to do both those things. I'm not an epidemiologist. I've got lots of questions I want to ask, lots of observations and challenges to the data and the policy. But in the end, what I want is freedom and parliamentary democracy, and that's what I'm fighting for.
Perfect. That's absolutely, that makes sense, and I'm supporting you from this channel. And lastly, I mean, what are your thoughts on the new kind of last minute rushed measures like the 10 p.m. curfew? Because we saw a bit of it. I was outside in central London. It's a bit of a chaotic situation. All the bars closed. Everyone was on the street, and everyone went to the tube together. It was like sardines. What do you think what do you think of the whole thing?
It's all highly undesirable, but a number of things which look absurd fall out of trying to reduce the amount of social contact that people have. You know, I've done it myself. I've pointed out that, kids can go to school but not a party afterwards, or go to work but not the pub together. And, absurdities arise, but we know why they arise. They arise because the government needs to reduce social contact in order to reduce the spread of the virus. And so we see these absurdities. But I think the argument is that in the hour between 10 and 11, people drink more and end up with more social contact. But this whole business is a real test of our virtue. If there is a real virus in society, and it's genuinely dangerous to those people who are vulnerable. So that means for all of us who are free and responsible citizens, actually we have got a duty to play the game. And I would not say to people that they should be looking for ways to get around this 10 p.m. cut off. We should just actually do the right thing by, frankly, our grandparents and reduce social contact.
I mean, the biggest issue I have is that I think you're right, the messaging kind of slightly changed. And if people out there thinking that, the new agenda is to completely eliminate the whole thing and it will go away, because, the evidence shows that even with the flu, the vaccine is only 10% successful. So we have to find ways to live with it long term anyway, instead of thinking one day we could make it turn into like zero case. I don't think that's going to happen, right?
Yeah, so a great friend of mine, Dr. Raghib Ali, who is an epidemiologist and also an acute medicine consultant who's been treating people with COVID. It's an unusual combination. He's written for Conservative Home against a second lockdown, and he has put in a proper professional review of the evidence and the factors involved. And I would really recommend that your viewers read it, because he, like me, does not want draconian measures to restrict our freedom. But he is a professional, not only, as I say, epidemiologist, but also acute medicine consultant. And I think his perspective is really worth following. So, yeah, we do have to learn to live with it. But the problem we've got all the time, if we're trying to minimise the harm to society, maximise human flourishing, you do have to accept that you've got to follow some of the evidence. So, for example, it'd be very attractive to shield the vulnerable, take certain measures, voluntary measures, to slow down the progress of the virus for the rest of us, and then just gently let it go through society. But there's some evidence that could be a good approach. The problem with that approach is it's very difficult to find the evidence that you can actually effectively shield the vulnerable from the disease. So you could end up with tens of thousands of people dying, and this really is a proper moral maze now. But my heart is for the approach I just sketched a moment ago, shielding people and taking measures to slow the spread of the virus, but accepting that there's a kind of agency problem here. We've become very, very arrogant. We think we can fight nature like this. But actually what we're seeing is, according to the Department of Health's own figures, if you look at quality adjusted life years, taking into account comorbidities, the lockdown did more harm than good. Well, we're going to have to start accepting soon that we live in a world where not everything's within our control. And one of those things is this virus. But that is a very hard message for my constituents who are vulnerable.
Yeah, the last question, because at this point, because everything's so passionate, the whole debate is heated, it's worse than Brexit, Remain, is when someone like yourself talked about civil liberties, some people would say, oh, that's trivial. But the other thing that, because we could argue, well, fine, at this point, if you're going to go crazy, then yeah, fine, let's just say it's trivial. The economy, when we talk about the economy, because I think the word economy, people just think, oh, you just talk about money and numbers. It's people's lives. Are you not actually?
It's what we do every day. It's fundamentally about the quality of the life we lead.
Yeah.
I mean, freedom under the rule of law, with parliamentary democracy, a degree of certainty about the rules that we have to follow, the ability to freely choose what we do with our time and our life is at the foundation of this great process of becoming that is to be alive. I want people to have joy in their lives and hope for the future. That does not come from living under a blanket of cloying rules which determine what you do and threaten you with £10,000 fines for leaving home. However, we've got a real disease in our society, and finding our way through this is tricky, but I am going to be consistently on the side of freedom.
Yeah, I'm just worried about the economic consequences long term. I think with obviously not just the death and everything else, it's going to take years, right, to recover.
Yeah, but look, let's not fall into a mistake here. I'm not suggesting you are, but lots of people are falling into the mistake of thinking it's lives versus the economy, but that's not true.
Yep.
If we let the economy go down, that will harm people's lives.
That's my point, exactly, yeah. It's not just numbers or money, it's people's jobs and people's livelihood and, food on their table, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, the lives that people lead, the length of those lives, the health of those lives, all turn on the quality of our economy. And so the non-health costs of lockdown, the economic costs, the educational costs are all really profound. People are going without cancer treatment. It is not as easy as just having a lockdown saving the day, but we still have to have regard for the people who are vulnerable to this disease. For them, it is an awful prospect.
Yes, well, no, absolutely, and thanks for your time. Obviously, we'll keep you guys posted on this whole amendment and what's going to happen in Parliament next week. And best of luck, Steve, and everyone who's obviously fighting for some sort of common sense at this point. And yes, any last few words?
No, just thanks very much indeed for having me on. It's always a pleasure. You're doing a great job, and thanks for what you're doing.
Thank you very much. Well, thanks for watching that interview. Again, apologies for the sound quality from Steve's side. I didn't know it until we actually finished the recording and I was editing. So sorry about that. But obviously it's useful to know exactly what's happening in Parliament with the executive and the whole debate on these emergency powers. And on this channel, we'll keep you guys posted as usual, because the mainstream media aren't really doing that. It doesn't matter, because we are the media. Don't forget to get your merchandise. The link is in the description. Also, support the channel by becoming a member. You get a lot of extra perks and benefits, including the weekly members-only podcast, Q&As, video Q&As, and a number of other things that we are going to be doing. The members of the channel get 10% discount for the merchandise as well. Thanks again for watching. I'm Tousi, and I'll see you guys in the next video.